For 4 years, I loved a woman with perfect memory, until I found her with 17 notebooks about me one morning. She couldn't remember anything. The truth. She forgets me completely every night and has to relearn our entire relationship from her notes every morning. My name is Alex, and for 4 years I was in love with a woman who had the most incredible gift I'd ever witnessed. She could remember everything, every conversation we'd ever had, every date we'd been on, every tiny detail of our relationship with perfect clarity. What I didn't know was that she wasn't remembering our life together at all. She was reading it from detailed notes she kept about me in 17 different notebooks, because she suffered from severe short-term memory loss and forgot me completely. Every single morning when she woke up, it started at a photography exhibition in downtown Seattle on a rainy Thursday. Evening in March, I was there covering the event for the arts magazine where I worked as a freelance writer, taking notes and snapping photos of the crowd. When I noticed this woman standing in front of a particular photograph for an unusually long time, she was staring at a black and white image of an elderly couple sitting on a park bench, and there were tears streaming down her face. Something about her reaction to the photo was so raw and genuine that I found myself walking over to her. "Are you okay?" I asked, offering her a tissue from my camera bag. She looked at me with these incredibly expressive brown eyes and smiled through her tears. "I'm fine, thank you. It's just ... That could be my grandparents. They used to sit on a bench exactly like that in the park near their house. I miss them." Her name was Sophie, and she had this quality I'd never encountered before. She seemed to be completely present in every moment, paying attention to details that most people missed. When we talked, she looked directly at me, asked thoughtful questions, and remembered every word I said with remarkable precision. "You said you work for Pacific Arts Monthly," she said about 20 minutes into our conversation. "That must be fascinating work. Do you focus on contemporary art, or do you cover historical exhibitions as well?" I was impressed that she'd remembered the specific name of the magazine I'd mentioned in passing. Most people I met at these events forgot basic details about my job within minutes. We talked for over an hour, and Sophie's memory for our conversation was extraordinary. She referenced things I'd said earlier, built on ideas we'd discussed, and seemed to catalog every detail of our interaction. When I asked for her number, she recited mine back to me perfectly after hearing it just once. "I have a good memory for important things," she said with a smile that made me feel like I was definitely important. I was 32. Recently out of a long-term relationship that had ended when my ex-girlfriend moved to New York for work. I'd been focused on my career, building my reputation as an arts journalist, and hadn't been actively looking for anyone serious. But Sophie intrigued me in a way I couldn't quite define. Our first official date was at a small Italian restaurant in Capitol Hill, and Sophie's attention to detail continued to amaze me. She remembered that I'd mentioned liking red wine over white at the gallery, that I was lactose intolerant, and that I'd grown up in Portland. She asked follow-up questions about things we'd discussed the week before, making me feel heard in a way that was completely new to me. "Mentioned your grandmother's influence on your love of art," she said over dinner. "Did she take you to museums when you were young?" The fact that she not only remembered that detail, but was genuinely curious about it, made me feel like she was truly interested in understanding who I was. Most people I dated seemed to be waiting for their turn to talk rather than really listening. To my stories, Sophie was a librarian at the University of Washington, which seemed perfect for someone with such an exceptional memory. She could recommend books based on obscure preferences I'd mentioned, remember which authors I'd said I wanted to read, and had seemingly infinite knowledge about literature, history, and art. "It's just part of the job," she said when I complimented her incredible recall. When you work with information all day, you develop systems for remembering things that matter. What impressed me most was how Sophie remembered not just facts, but emotions and context. She could recall the exact mood I'd been in when I told her about a difficult conversation with my editor. Remember that I'd been excited about a particular assignment, and follow up on things I'd mentioned being worried about weeks earlier. "How did the interview with that sculptor go?" she asked during our 5th date. "You seemed nervous about it because you said his work was outside your usual area of expertise." The interview had been 3 weeks earlier, and I'd only mentioned my nervousness about it briefly during a phone conversation. The fact that she remembered and cared enough to ask about it made me feel incredibly valued. As our relationship deepened over the first few months, Sophie's memory became one of the things I loved most about her. She never forgot anniversaries, remembered exactly how I liked my coffee, and could recount conversations we'd had on specific dates with perfect accuracy. Remember on our second date, when you told me about visiting that gallery in Portland? When you were 12, she said one evening as we walked through Pike Place Market. You said it was the first time you realized art could make you feel something profound. I think about that story often. I barely remembered telling her that story, but she could quote almost exactly what I'd said. It made me feel like every word I spoke to her mattered, like she treasured our conversations enough to preserve them. Perfectly in her mind, Sophie also had detailed knowledge of my preferences that seemed to come from careful attention to things I'd said or done. She knew I preferred tea to coffee in the mornings, that I liked to read fiction before bed, that I got anxious in large crowds, and that I had a particular fondness for 1940s jazz. I brought some Billie Holiday, she said one evening when she came over to my apartment. You mentioned loving her voice when we walked past that record store last month. The gift was thoughtful, but what moved me more was that she'd remembered such a small, casual comment and had acted on it weeks later. After we'd been dating for about 6 months, I started spending more time at Sophie's apartment, and I began to notice some unusual things about how she organized her life. She kept detailed written schedules, had notes posted throughout her apartment, reminding herself of various tasks and appointments, and maintained what seemed like an elaborate filing system for personal documents. I like to stay organized, she explained, when I asked about all the papers and notebooks scattered around her home office. My work requires keeping track of a lot of information, so I've developed systems that help me manage everything. Explanation made sense. But some of her organizational habits seemed excessive, even for someone in a detail-oriented profession. She had notebooks dedicated to tracking conversations with friends, calendars with incredibly specific notes about daily activities, and what appeared to be detailed logs of her personal life. I also noticed that Sophie sometimes seemed slightly disoriented first thing in the morning, taking a few minutes to fully wake up and get her bearings. She'd always check her phone immediately. Upon waking, reading through what appeared to be messages or notes she'd left for herself. I'm not a morning person, she said, when I mentioned her morning routine. I need a few minutes to get my brain working properly. Another thing that struck me as unusual was how Sophie interacted with her family and long-term friends. She seemed to have somewhat distant relationships with people who should have been important to her, and she often needed to check her phone or consult notes when they called or visited. Sophie seems different somehow. Her sister mentioned too. Me, during a family barbecue we attended together. She used to be much more spontaneous, more emotionally connected. Now she seems like she's always thinking about something else. When I asked Sophie about her sister's comment, she seemed uncomfortable and deflected the question. People change as they get older, she said. I've become more focused on my career and my relationship with you. Maybe that makes me seem different to family members who don't see me as often. The explanation was reasonable, but I started paying more attention to Sophie's interactions with people from her past. She seemed to rely heavily on written notes and reminders when talking to old friends, and sometimes appeared to be struggling to remember things that should have been significant shared experiences. About a year into our relationship, Sophie suggested we take a weekend trip to Vancouver. She'd planned every detail meticulously, with printed itineraries, restaurant reservations, and a carefully organized schedule of activities. You're incredibly thorough, I said as she showed me the thick folder of trip materials she'd prepared. I want everything to be perfect, she replied. This is our first real vacation together, and I want us to have amazing memories. The trip was wonderful, but I noticed that Sophie documented everything extensively. She took photos constantly, wrote detailed notes about our activities in a small journal she carried everywhere. It seemed almost compulsive about recording our experiences. Are you writing a travel blog or something? I asked, watching her fill several pages with notes about a museum we'd visited. I just want to remember everything perfectly, she said. Sometimes details fade over time, and I want to be able to recall exactly how I felt in each moment with you. Her dedication to preserving our memories was touching, but it also seemed slightly obsessive. Most people are content to let some details fade, but Sophie seemed determined to capture and record every aspect of our shared experiences. The first real sign that something was seriously wrong came during our second year together. When Sophie had what appeared to be a panic attack during a dinner party at my friend Mike's house, we were sitting around the table with 3 other couples, sharing stories and having what seemed like a normal evening, when Sophie suddenly became very quiet and started looking around the room with what appeared to be confusion. "Excuse me," she said abruptly, standing up from the table. "I need to use the bathroom." She was gone for almost 15 minutes, and when she returned, she seemed disoriented and was checking her phone constantly. For the rest of the evening, she barely spoke and seemed to be struggling to follow the conversation. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked her in the car afterward. "I'm fine," she said, but she was still checking her phone obsessively. I just felt overwhelmed for a moment. Sometimes social situations can be exhausting. That night, Sophie left my apartment around midnight, claiming she needed to get home to prepare for an early morning meeting. It was unusual for her to leave so abruptly, but I assumed she was just tired from the social anxiety she'd experienced earlier. The next morning, I called Sophie to check on her and was surprised by her response. "I'm sorry, who is this?" said when she answered the phone. "It's Alex," I said, confused. "Your boyfriend?" "I'm calling to see how you're feeling after last night." There was a long pause. Alex ... Yes, of course. "I'm sorry, I was half asleep." "Last night was fine. Thank you for asking." Her response seemed odd, formal and distant, in a way that was completely unlike her usual warm communication style. When I saw her later that week, she seemed back to normal, remembering our conversation and asking about my work with her usual detailed attention. Over the next few months, I started noticing a pattern of small inconsistencies in Sophie's behavior. Sometimes she'd seem surprised by things she should have remembered, or would ask questions about topics we'd discussed extensively. But she'd always recover quickly, and her overall memory for our relationship remained impressively detailed. Began to suspect that Sophie might be dealing with some kind of health issue she wasn't telling me about. The organizational systems that had once seemed admirably thorough now struck me as potentially compensatory behaviors for some underlying problem. The breaking point came during our 3rd year together, and I decided to surprise Sophie with an impromptu visit to her apartment on a Saturday morning. I had a key, which she'd given me several months earlier. I thought it would be romantic to bring her coffee and pastries for a lazy weekend morning. When I quietly let myself into her apartment around 8 a.m., I found Sophie sitting at her kitchen table, surrounded by notebooks and papers, reading intently with a look of intense concentration on her face. "Good morning, beautiful," I said softly. Not wanting to startle her, Sophie looked up at me with complete confusion and what appeared to be fear. "Who are you?" she said, backing away from the table. "How did you get into my apartment?" I stood frozen, holding the coffee and pastries, trying to process what was happening. "Sophie, it's me. It's Alex, your boyfriend. You gave me a key." She stared at me blankly for several long moments, then looked down at the notebook spread. Across her table, I could see that they contained what appeared to be detailed notes about our relationship, photos of me, transcripts of conversations, lists of my preferences, and personal details. "Give me a moment," she said quietly. I began reading through the notebooks frantically as I watched. Sophie's expression gradually changed from confusion to recognition to deep embarrassment. She was literally reading about our relationship, as if she were studying for an exam and slowly remembering who I was based on the extensive notes she'd kept about me. "Alex," she said finally, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you." "Told me what?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand something terrible. Sophie took a deep breath and looked at me with a combination of love and profound sadness. "I have anterograde amnesia," she said quietly. "I can't form new long-term memories. Every morning when I wake up, I don't remember anything that's happened since my accident 3.5 years ago. I don't remember you, our relationship, or our life together. I have to read about it in these notebooks to know who you are and what we mean to each other. The words hit me like a physical blow. What accident? I was in a car crash 4 years ago, Sophie said, gesturing to the notebooks. I suffered severe brain trauma that damaged my hippocampus. I can remember everything from before the accident perfectly, but I can't retain new memories for more than a few hours. I sat down heavily in one of her kitchen chairs, trying to process what she was telling me. But you remember everything about our relationship, I said. You know, details about conversations we had years ago. You remember my preferences, my stories, everything? Sophie held up one of the notebooks. 'Cause I write it all down. Every conversation, every date, every detail about you and about us. I spend 2 hours every morning reading these notes so I can pretend to remember our life together. I looked at the notebooks scattered across her table and realized I was seeing an elaborate system designed to simulate memory. There were photos of us together with detailed captions describing when and where they were taken. Of our conversations, lists of my favorite foods and movies, analyses of my moods and preferences, and what appeared to be a comprehensive database of our entire relationship. How long have you been doing this? I asked. Since our second date, Sophie said. I realized that first night at the gallery that I was attracted to you. But I knew that if I told you about my condition, you'd never want to build a relationship with someone who couldn't remember you from day to day. So you've been lying to me for 3 years? I've been loving you for 3 years, she said, tears flowing freely now. Alex, I may not be able to remember falling in love with you, but I fall in love with you again every single morning when I read about our life together. These notebooks aren't just records of our relationship, they're love letters. I write to my future self about the most important person in my life. I picked up one of the notebooks and began reading her entries. About me? The detail was extraordinary, but more than that, the emotion was unmistakable. Every entry conveyed deep love, genuine fascination with who I was as a person, and commitment to preserving not just facts about our relationship, but the feelings that accompanied every interaction. March 15th, Alex told me about his grandmother's influence on his love of art today. The way his face lit up when he talked about her taking him to museums made my heart ache with tenderness. I need to remember to ask him more about those early experiences that shaped who he became. June 3rd made dinner for Alex tonight. He said it was perfect, but more importantly, he seemed relaxed and happy. I love being able to take care of him. Note, he prefers less salt on the pasta, more herbs in the sauce. September 12th, Alex had a difficult day at work. I could see the stress in his shoulders when he came home. Gave him a back massage and just listened while he talked through his frustration with his editor. Bud. Being able to comfort someone you love is one of the most precious gifts in the world. Page after page revealed the depth of Sophie's dedication to our relationship and her elaborate efforts to love me fully, despite her neurological limitations. You've been studying me like a subject, I said, feeling hurt and confused. I've been studying you like a person I'm desperately in love with and terrified of losing, Sophie corrected. Alex, do you have any idea what it's like to wake up every morning and not recognize the most important person in your life? To have to read about your own happiness like it's a story someone else wrote? I was quiet for a long time, trying to understand the magnitude of what Sophie had been dealing with, and the elaborate deception she'd maintained to protect our relationship. Why didn't you tell me? I asked finally. Because I was afraid you'd leave, she said simply. And because I wanted to experience what it felt like to be loved for who I am, not pitied for what I've lost. But Sophie, this means our entire relationship has been built on a lie. No, she said firmly. Our entire relationship has been built on the most elaborate expression of love I'm capable of giving. I may not remember falling in love with you, but I choose to love you again every single day based on who you are and how you make me feel, even if I can only access those feelings through reading about them. I spent the next several hours reading through Sophie's notebooks. What I discovered was a more detailed and thoughtful record of our relationship than I could have maintained with a perfect memory. She had documented not just events, but emotions, growth, conflicts, and resolutions. She had analyzed my personality, tracked changes in our dynamic, and recorded her own emotional journey with remarkable insight. Oh. You know me better than I know myself, I realized. Looking up from a notebook entry where she had accurately predicted how I'd react to a work situation based on previous patterns. She'd observed and recorded. "I've had to study you intensively to love you properly," she said. "Most people take their memories for granted. I have to be completely intentional about preserving every detail of what we share together." The revelation forced me to confront what love actually means. Sophie couldn't remember our first kiss, but she'd written about it so thoroughly that she could describe not just what happened, but exactly how it had made her feel. She couldn't recall our first "I love you," but she'd documented the moment with such care that she could relive the emotion even without the neurological ability to remember it. "Do you love me?" I asked her directly. "I love the person I learn about in these notebooks every morning," she said. "I love the man I discover myself to be in love with when I read about our life together. I love you so much that I've spent 3 years creating an external memory system just so I could continue being your girlfriend." It took me 2 weeks to process everything Sophie had told me, during which time she gave me space, while continuing to document our interactions and her own emotional journey through the crisis her revelation had created. When I finally returned to her apartment, I found her reading through the notebooks that covered the period since she'd told me the truth. "How do you feel about me now?" I asked. "I mean, now that I know about your condition, how does that change what you read about us every morning?" Sophie looked up from her notes with a sad smile. "It's complicated," she said. "I read about a man I fell in love with who has now learned something difficult about me. I read about my fear that he might leave, and about my hope that he might understand. I read about love being tested by truth, and I don't know how the story ends." "The story doesn't end," I told her. "It does change." Over the next several months, Sophie and I rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of complete honesty. About her condition, she taught me how to help her with her memory systems, and I learned to be patient with the daily process of reconnecting that her neurological situation required. The most difficult adjustment was understanding that while Sophie could love me deeply, she couldn't miss me in the way that neurotypical people miss their partners. When we were apart, she had no continuous memory of me to feel nostalgic about, no ability to anticipate seeing me again with emotional continuity from our previous time together. "It's like I love you completely while we're together, and then you cease to exist for me until I read about you the next morning," she explained. "I can't miss you because I can't remember you, but I can love you completely each time I rediscover who you are." I also had to learn how to be in relationship with someone whose love for me was both intensely documented and emotionally discontinuous. Sophie knew more facts about me than anyone ever had, but her emotional connection to me had to be rebuilt from scratch. Every day based on her notes and our immediate interactions. "Choose it fresh every day," Sophie said one evening, as she updated her notebooks with details from our dinner together. "I can't love you out of habit or take you for granted. Every day I have to decide again that you're worth loving based on what I learn about who we are together." 2 years later, Sophie and I got married in a small ceremony attended by close friends and family who understood her condition. Instead of traditional vows, we each read from Sophie's notebooks. I read her entries about falling in love with me, and she read her entries about my proposal, which she documented in extraordinary detail to preserve the emotional significance of the moment. "I may not be able to remember this wedding tomorrow," Sophie said during the ceremony, "but I'm going to write about it tonight in a way that will help me fall in love with this moment, and with you all over again every time." I read it. Our marriage works because Sophie's condition taught both of us to be completely intentional about love. Nothing in our relationship is taken for granted because Sophie literally can't take anything for granted. Every interaction is precious because it might be lost without careful documentation. I've also learned to find meaning in being loved by someone who chooses me fresh every day. Sophie's love for me isn't based on accumulated history or comfort with familiarity. It's based on who I am in each present moment and how I make her feel during our time together. 5 years after discovering the truth about Sophie's condition, I understand that she wasn't deceiving me during those first 3 years. She was protecting something precious and fragile so it could grow strong enough to survive the truth. The notebooks have grown into an entire library chronicling our life together. And Sophie still spends her mornings reading about our love story and her evenings updating it with new chapters. She knows me more thoroughly than anyone ever has, and I know her in ways that go deeper than memory. My name is Alex Morrison, and I'm married to a woman who forgets me every single night and falls in love with me again every morning. Her inability to remember our past taught me that love isn't about remembering yesterday, it's about choosing each other today.